Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. In this collection of 3 compelling paranormal accounts, we explore more unexplainable incidents of brushes with the dearly deceased. Join George Newbury, Jake Simmons and Brooke Hawkins as they experience a whistling spirit in Toledo, a final ghostly goodbye in Atlanta, and a smoking spectre in Newark. The Whistling Spirit. In the spring of 2003, George Newbury, a seasoned service technician with over a decade of experience, received a routine work order for maintenance of a residential water softener in a quiet suburb in Toledo, Ohio. Little did he know that this ordinary service call would lead to an extraordinary encounter that would stay with him for decades to come. On a mild Tuesday morning, on May the 6th, George arrived at the modest 2-story home of the Edelmans. He was greeted at the door by Mrs. Edelman, a woman in her early 60s with greying hair and kind eyes. She led George to the basement where the water softener was located, her movements slow and deliberate. As George set to work, the familiar sounds of tools and equipment filled the air. But above the mechanical noises, he began to notice something else. A cheerful whistling coming from what he assumed was a nearby room. The tune was simple yet catchy, repeating in a loop that spoke of contentment and routine. George smiled to himself, picturing Mr. Edelman puttering away in his workshop, lost in the joy of his hobby. For about 25 minutes, George worked on the water softener while the whistling continued, providing a pleasant backdrop to his task. As he finished up and prepared the billing invoice, he decided to pop his head into the workshop to explain the repairs to Mr. Edelman and perhaps complimenting on his whistling skills. George approached the door where he thought the sound had been coming from, but as he drew near, the whistling abruptly stopped. Curious, he peered into the room, expecting to see Mr. Edelman at work. Instead, he was met with darkness and silence. The workshop was empty, tools neatly arranged on shelves and workbenches, showing no signs of recent use. Puzzled, George assumed Mr. Edelman must have gone upstairs while he was finishing up his work. Shrugging off the odd occurrence, George made his way back upstairs to find Mrs. Edelman and provide her with the invoice. As he handed her the paperwork, he casually mentioned that he had hoped to explain the repairs to her husband, but had just missed him in the workshop. As the words left his lips, Mrs. Edelman's face drained of colour, her eyes widening with a mix of shock and disbelief. Concerned, George tried to lighten the mood, mentioning the tune he had heard her husband whistling while completing his work. He whistled a few bars of it, thinking it might bring a smile to her face. Instead, Mrs. Edelman's eyes welled up with tears. In a trembling voice, she revealed that her husband had passed away suddenly just 3 weeks prior. The tune George had whistled was one her late husband had loved, a melody he had whistled for years, especially when he was working in his beloved workshop. As the reality of the situation sank in, George felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear, but from a profound sense of awe. He realised that what he had experienced was not just an auditory illusion, but potentially a glimpse into the world beyond, a world where love and routine persisted even after death. Leaving the Edelman home that day, George couldn't shake the feeling that he had been privy to something truly special. The spirit of Mr. Edelman, it seemed, was still very much present in the home he had loved, watching over his grieving wife and continuing his favourite pastimes. The encounter left a lasting impression on George. In the years that followed, Whenever he entered a client's home, he found himself listening more closely, more aware of the possibility that not all presences could be seen with the naked eye. The whistling spirit had opened his mind to the idea that love and connection could transcend the boundaries between life and death, leaving him with a comforting sense that perhaps in some way we never truly leave those we care about behind. A final goodbye. In the summer of 2019, just a day after laying his beloved grandmother to rest, 17-year-old Jake Simmons found himself alone in the family home in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. It was a warm afternoon on August the 12th at around 2:30 p.m, and Jake was trying to keep his mind occupied by making pizza, a cherished activity that he had often done with his grandmother, Dorothy. As he worked in the kitchen, Jake had put on some music to fill the silence of the empty house. The upbeat rhythm of Let's Groove by Earth, Wind and Fire filled the air, a song he would later learn was his grandmother's favourite. Lost in thought and memories, Jake stepped into the hallway to fetch something. As he passed by his grandmother's room, something caught his eye that made him freeze in his tracks. There, just outside the bedroom door, a figure began to rise. It wasn't a fleeting shadow or a trick of the light. It was his grandmother, Dorothy, appearing as clearly as if she was still alive. Every detail was perfect, from the soft waves of her silver hair to the kind wrinkles around her eyes. For 5 long seconds, Jake stood motionless, locked in a surreal staring contest with the apparition of his recently deceased grandmother. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, Dorothy vanished. One moment she was there, solid and real, and the next she was gone, leaving Jake alone in the hallway with his heart racing. The experience left Jake shaken but oddly comforted. In those brief moments, he felt he had been given a final goodbye from his grandmother, a chance to see her one last time outside of his memories and dreams. In the years that followed, Jake would often think back to that summer afternoon, wondering about the nature of life, death, and the bonds that connect us, even beyond the grave. The memory of his grandmother's apparition remained vivid, a reminder that sometimes love finds a way to bridge even the widest of gaps. The Smoking Spectre. In the autumn of 2023, Thomas Hawkins, an elderly man in his late 80s, was nearing the end of his life. Living in his long-time home in Newark, New Jersey, Thomas was battling severe dementia and suffering from weekly strokes. His granddaughter Brooke lived nearby and visited often, though Thomas could no longer recognise her or any other family members. On Tuesday, October 3rd, Brooke received an urgent call from Maria, Thomas's full-time caregiver. Maria reported a strange smell of smoke in the house and odd behaviour from Thomas. Worried this might be a sign of impending death, Brooke rushed over. As soon as she entered the house, Brooke was hit by the strong scent of cigarette smoke. This was puzzling, as neither Thomas nor his late wife had ever smoked, and the house had security cameras that would have caught any of the caregivers smoking indoors. When Brooke entered Thomas's room, she saw something remarkable. Her grandfather, who had been mostly silent for months, was speaking in full, coherent sentences. But he wasn't talking to Brooke or Maria. Instead, he was focused intently on an empty corner of the room, having what seemed to be a lively conversation with someone called Jack. For about 20 minutes, Thomas chatted away, discussing weekend plans, a lawnmower he was fixing, and a new pool they were planning to install. He even mentioned some problems he was having with his wife, Eleanor, who had passed away 5 years earlier. Brooke immediately recognised the name Jack. Jack Thompson had been Thomas's brother-in-law and best friend, but he had died 15 years ago in 2008. Jack had been a heavy smoker, rarely seen without a cigarette in hand. As Thomas continued his one-sided conversation, Brooke and Maria tried to get his attention, but he seemed completely unaware of their presence. His eyes never left that empty corner of the room. What made the whole thing even stranger was the smell of smoke. Brooke and Maria checked the entire house but couldn't find any source for the odour. It seemed to be coming from nowhere and was only present in Thomas's room. After about half an hour, Thomas suddenly stopped talking and went back to his usual unresponsive state. At the same time, the smell of smoke disappeared as quickly as it had come. This experience deeply shook Brooke. She had never believed in ghosts or the paranormal, but what she had witnessed was hard to explain. She knew that people with dementia often have hallucinations, but the smell of smoke seemed to indicate something more mysterious. Thomas lived for just over a week after this incident, finally passing away peacefully on October 11th, 2023. As sad as Brooke was to lose her grandfather, she found some comfort in the idea that he might have been reconnecting with old friends and loved ones who had passed on before him. This strange encounter left Brooke questioning what she believed about life and death. While she still isn't sure exactly what happened that day, the experience opened her mind to the possibility that there might be more to our world than what we can readily perceive.